Today I want to talk about articles in Spanish and when and how to use them. Articles are confusing even in English, so when you're an English speaker learning Spanish, some of the differences make them a little bit tricky. First off, what is an article? In language, an article is a word such as a, an, or the that modifies a noun to indicate whether it is specific or general. There are two types, definite and indefinite. In English, the definite article is the, and the indefinite articles are a and an. In Spanish, the definite articles are el, la, los, and las, and the indefinite articles are un, una, unos, and unas. Articles work differently in Spanish compared to English in a few key ways. The first, and one of the most important, is that Spanish articles have gender. Every noun in Spanish is either masculine or feminine, and the article must match. For example, la casa, la is used in front of casa because casa is a feminine noun. Or el libro, the book, el is used in front of libro because libro is a masculine noun. Another difference with Spanish articles is that they have plural forms, meaning that they change depending on the number. So we have el and los, el for singular, los for plural, masculine, and then we have la and las. La is for singular, feminine, and las is for plural, feminine. And then we also have un and unos and una and unas. In English, we only have the and a and an, which are all singular articles. The next way in which Spanish articles differ from English ones is that Spanish tends to use articles more often, and in many times uses them in places where English doesn't. For example, we have the sentence, me duele la cabeza, my head hurts. In English, we just say, my head hurts, whereas in Spanish, the literal translation is, the head hurts me. And another example is the sentence, me gusta el fútbol, I like soccer. And in Spanish, we have to say, el fútbol, whereas in English, you just say, I like soccer, and we don't say, I like the soccer. The fourth way that Spanish articles differ from English is almost an opposite of the previous one, in that sometimes Spanish drops an article where the English equivalent would not. This is especially true with professions. For example, in English, you would say, I am a doctor, but in Spanish, you would just say, soy doctor. So sometimes Spanish uses articles where English doesn't, but also sometimes drops them where English uses them. So how do we know when to use them and when to not use them in Spanish? As a rule of thumb, in Spanish, you need to use an article when talking about a specific person, place, or thing, or when talking about a concept generally. In Spanish, you use the definite articles el, la, los, and las to refer to specific things. These are equivalent to the English word the. An example is el libro está en la mesa. The book is on the table. In Spanish, you also use a definite article to refer to a general concept in its entirety. For example, me gusta el pizza. I like pizza. You're not saying I like the pizza, you're just saying I like pizza. Next, we have days of the week where you have to use an article for a general mention of a day of the week. For example, el lunes tengo clase. On Monday, I have class. You also have to use definite articles when referring to a person by their title. For example, el doctor Ramirez es muy bueno. Dr. Ramirez is very good. In English, we always can just say Dr. Ramirez, whereas in Spanish, the proper way is to use the article el in front of the title, el Dr. Ramirez. This is the same for titles such as señor or señora. It is correct to say la señora and el señor before the person's name. One more example of when you need to use articles is for languages. When you're referring to a language as a topic, for example, el español es un idioma hermoso, you have to say el español. So how about the opposite side? When do you not use articles in Spanish? The first case is for jobs, professions, or nationalities. When referring to any of these, you don't use an article. Some examples are ella es profesora, she is a professor, or ella es argentina, she is Argentinian. In both of these cases, you don't need to use an article. The second case where you don't need articles in Spanish is with proper nouns such as cities, countries, states, months, etc. For example, in the sentence, en Mexico hay diferentes acentos. In Mexico, there are different accents. That one is similar to English, so it is fairly easy. But this next one is different than English. In Spanish, if the quantity you are referring to is not important, you do not need an article. For example, in the sentence, no tengo un coche, I don't have a car. In English, we have to say we don't have a car, but in Spanish, no tengo coche, you don't actually need to put un coche. This one is a little bit confusing. I would also be tempted to add an article before the noun in these cases, but it is not required. Building upon a case we discussed earlier where you do need an article when referring to people by their title, there are some cases when you do not need to use the article. This is when you are directly addressing somebody with a title. So if you're talking to a doctor directly, you would not say, Hola, el doctor Ramirez. You would just say, Hola, Dr. Ramirez. One more case of when not to use articles in Spanish is a little bit more specific, but for certain verbs like hablar, aprender, and estudiar, after these verbs, you don't need an article. For example, in the sentence hablo español, there isn't an article. You don't need to say hablo el español. After the verb hablar, you can just use the noun without an article. Hablo español. Again, this is similar to English, where you would just be saying, I speak Spanish. So that's a breakdown of a lot of the cases of when to use and when not to use articles in Spanish. One more topic I want to cover is articles with seasons, because this tends to be a little bit confusing. In Spanish, when you're talking about a season generally, you need to use an article. For example, if I want to say winter is cold, the Spanish translation would be el invierno es frío. In English, you're saying winter is cold, but in Spanish, you need to say el invierno. If you translate it literally, it's saying the winter is cold, but in Spanish, it just means winter is cold, el invierno es frío. Another example, el verano es mi estación favorita. Summer is my favorite season. When you don't need an article when talking about seasons is number one, after the verb ser, to be. For example, es verano, it's summer. Or number two, after the words en and de. For example, voy a Mexico en verano. Or another example, nos vamos en primavera. We're leaving in the spring. So that's everything I wanted to cover in today's video. I hope that is helpful and that now you have a little bit of a better understanding of when to use articles in Spanish, as they are very important. And since they're a little bit different from their uses in English, it is something that might require a little bit more practice and study, but nonetheless is not impossible to get right, just needs a little bit of attention. So that's everything for today. Thank you so much and good luck with your articles.